Thanks so much for letting me be with you again this week, Mount Hermon Family Camp. This is the first time I've been here Labor Day, and it's a real treat, especially when you have worship like that. Let's give these guys another round of applause. Fantastic. Such great stuff. I don't know what you're thinking, but I know what I'm thinking when I see them up there. They're also great looking, just amazing. It's not funny. And you just, when they walk up on the stage, you're going, okay, this is going to be good. And then I come up and you're thinking, this better be good. So we're going to talk this morning about dealing with disappointment. Now, actually, I love that last night when Mark introduced his family. I thought, what a cool idea. And so I thought, you know what? I brought a couple of pictures of my girls. This is my daughters here. This is Aaron and Katie. This is actually their confirmation party. Okay, now, so you're laughing, but we go to an Episcopal church. But these are the girls in the family here. That's Katie on the far right, then her older sister, Erin. And then on the far left, that's Sadie, my granddaughter, who just yesterday walked onto Biola University campus for the very first time as a freshman. And then that girl to the left of Sadie there, that's my wife, Maggie. And I married her 51 years ago. And we're starting to get very serious about each other. And the result of this union is that crew right there. That was at our 50th anniversary last year up in Maine. And great folks all around. So I am so much looking forward to this week. And one of my favorite studies I did with my youth group back when I was a youth pastor several years ago was a multi-week series that I just called Epic Conversations. Epic Conversations. And what was fun about it was just kind of gave me a chance to go back through the scriptures and pretty much kind of identify what I thought were sort of unique and intriguing conversations. And of course, there are many. Now, obviously this weekend, we don't have time to go back and inventory all those conversations that I did back then. What I did was, in thinking about this weekend, I actually picked three of my favorites. And so what's going to happen here, beginning this morning, is a little mini series. Since it's family weekend, we're going to talk about epic conversations, a mom, a dad, and a bad dancer. So epic conversations, a mom, a dad, and a bad dancer. We probably all noticed, especially in our current political season, that the national press loves to take every opportunity to catch one of the presidential candidates making some embarrassing speaking gaffe, right? I think most of us would agree, regardless of your political persuasions, that they have a lot of material to work with. But there is, admittedly, something that's kind of fun. Maybe sort of naughty, but, it's a little fun sometimes when public figures, some famous personality misspeaks or botches their word. Just kind of helps you feel a little bit better about yourself, I guess. And, of course, there are tons of these. You probably have seen them online that have just been immortalized on the internet. For example, boxer Mike Tyson worried that he might fade into oblivion. Or the cop out in Pennsylvania, my state, who helpfully explained to a TV news reporter that homicide victims rarely talk to police. Then there was the comment by the great movie mogul Sam Goldwyn, who complained that making a deal with a certain well-known Hollywood player was like sticking your head in a moose. I think he meant noose. Although I don't know, maybe it was really, really unpleasant. And then, of course, there's the great Yogi Berra complaining, it ain't the heat, it's the humility. And then I love this one, the pastor who confused the groom just a little bit when he said, it is customary to cuss the bride. I like that one. Or how about this one? Some of you might remember this, Al Gore attacking George Bush by observing a zebra does not change his spots. But it is kind of the classic. This is my favorite. Britney Spears kicking off her concert in Manchester, England by screaming to the fans, "What's up, London?" It's just fun. But the reason I mention this morning is because the passage we're going to study this morning, the epic conversation in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 15, is probably one of the most scandalous in all the Gospels, because we actually hear what sounds like a major gaffe, some serious misspeaking by none other than Jesus himself. So if you have a Bible, I want to invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. I'm going to put this passage up on the screen so we can all read along. But Matthew chapter 15, beginning in verse 21, an epic conversation indeed. Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O God, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she's crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. It's kind of a crazy passage, isn't it? I mean, you have to admit, here's a woman who comes to Jesus. She's worried about her daughter, who is facing some kind of severe psychiatric, maybe physical distress. She describes her daughter as being oppressed by a demon, for crying out loud. She's pleading for Jesus' help, and it just sounds like Jesus is basically telling her, no way, you know what, go to the back of the line. It's not your turn for grace. Israel first, and then you Gentile dogs. It just, let's be honest, it's not a good look for Jesus. In essence, he's called this woman, a Canaanite woman, a dog. And by the way, this is an especially tricky passage if you're the publisher of a children's Bible. But this text has sort of been debated over the years, because by Bible scholars who go, what's going on here? Everybody's trying to figure out, what is this? Is Jesus truly prejudiced? Or is he just heartless? Or is he just grumpy? I even actually heard one sermon, true story, where the preacher just basically paved over the whole problem by saying, oh, that's easy. Jesus made a mistake. He just misspoke. He's a nice guy, and he's God. Like, oh my gosh, he's like totally God. But oops, the word became flesh, misspoke. Which is why this incident in Matthew chapter 15 is so worth our time this morning. Because in fact, it tells us a very different story, an amazing story. It truly is an epic conversation, because it's a story that shows us Jesus being Jesus. Now, because this narrative has kind of a lot of twists and turns, I want us to take a little bit of time to walk through the passage verse by verse and set the stage. If we start off early in chapter 15 of Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has had a nasty confrontation with the scribes and the Pharisees, who basically talk a good game when it comes to the law of Moses, but who are pretty much empty robes when it comes down to a life of faith that responds, a heart. In fact, Jesus, you'll remember this, describes him in verse 8 of chapter 15 by saying, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." And suffice it to say, these scribes and Pharisees totally looked down on the Canaanites, the non-Jewish Gentiles. They were just basically considered unclean lowlifes. Good Jews, in fact, were supposed to keep their distance. You don't touch Gentiles. You don't talk to Gentiles. You don't even go into their homes. You do not friend them on Facebook. This was social distancing before there was social distancing. In fact, it's interesting. Unless it was absolutely necessary, You weren't even supposed to go into the towns and the regions where these Gentiles lived. So Matthew is already telling us something significant when he tells us in verse 21 that Jesus leaves directly from his encounter with the separatist Pharisees. And in verse 21, he crosses the border. He crosses the border into the region of Tyre, a region populated by Gentiles. So he wasn't just crossing a geographical border. He was crossing a big cultural no man's land. And supposedly, the plan was to kind of keep it all low key, but that's not what happened. Because remember, even though this region was on the other side of the border, it's only about 20 miles from Capernaum and the region of Galilee. And when somebody's, working miracles and healing people and raising folk from the dead, word tends to get around, right? You can imagine when word got out that Jesus was in town, it was basically kind of a first century flash mob. It would be like if, Taylor Swift came to your oboe recital. People are going to take notice. They're going to show up. And that's when Jesus is approached. That's the stage on which this drama plays out. Jesus is approached by this woman, described in the Gospel of Mark in this incident as Syrophoenician, which means she's Greek. She's a Gentile. And actually, since we're talking about speaking gaffes this morning, two of my favorites actually involve this particular term. It was a few years ago. I'm a college professor, and a student was doing a talk, a little mini sermon about precisely this passage, and he referred to this woman as the pseudoephedrine woman. And I know. Well, several years ago in my youth group, I had a kid refer to her as the neosynephrine woman. So somehow she kind of became the patron saint of head colds, but it's definitely a term that's insulting. When Matthew refers to this woman as a Canaanite, this is kind of a slang term for Gentiles. Okay, so it would be like calling somebody from Texas a cowboy, or somebody says I'm from Norway. They go, oh, a Viking. It's just kind of an insulting term. But I want you to look at verse 22, because when this woman sees Jesus, even though she knows she's outcast, verse 22, she comes up and cries out, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." And it's interesting because here's a Gentile woman who probably doesn't really know a ton about Jesus, but what she does know, what little she does know, she acts on it. She acts on it. First of all, you'll notice she calls him Lord. She calls him Lord. And this really has more probably a term of respect than any kind of theological content. This is basically the woman saying, from what I can tell, from what I can see, you're in charge here. You're in charge here. But then second, she actually calls him Son of David. Son of David, which was widely known as the term Jews used for the Messiah, So again, it's as if this woman's saying, look, I don't know a lot, and I don't even think I fully comprehend everything I do know, but I know enough to believe that what they say about you may be true. And so she cries out, Son of David, have mercy on me. And it's precisely at that point where we meet this kind of keen disappointment with Jesus, this disturbing conversation, because Matthew tells us that in response to the woman, if you look at the text, verse 23, Matthew tells us Jesus did not answer her a word. He didn't answer her a word. And that just, I don't know about you, but that just seems weird. But of course, the woman persists. She persists. She's even louder now, more deliberate. She's even started kind of pestering the disciples, maybe hoping they will sort of intervene on her behalf. In fact, she's so persistent, and they're so annoyed or embarrassed they start to beg Jesus to please, for everybody's sake, do something to make this woman kind of disappear. And Matthew tells us in verse 23, his disciples came and begged him, please, Jesus, send her away. But, do you remember that quote several years ago from Sarah Palin when she said, the only difference between a hockey mom and a pit bull is lipstick? And that's kind of what's happening here. This woman basically goes from Syrophoenician to Sarah Palin in about one verse. And it's starting to get intense. You can sort of see it. Now, it's clear at this point, she is not going anywhere. She is fixed on two desperate convictions. Number one, my daughter's life. My daughter's life is in danger. Conviction number two, Jesus, you are her one and only hope. And it's when the disciples plead with Jesus to do something that we all of a sudden get this kind of weird open mic moment when Jesus seems to misspeak. He says to the disciples in verse 24, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, which on its face sounds, in fact, like he's telling the disciples, look, she's a Gentile. She's not our problem. You make her go away. And critics of Jesus have jumped on this verse because they say it's a sign that Jesus was prejudiced, even racist when it came to the Gentiles. That Jesus' attitude was that the Jews were God's chosen people and that everybody else God chose to ignore. And when you first kind of look at this passage, you have to honestly ask, is that true? Is that true? Did Jesus really believe he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and the low-life Gentiles, they're just kind of left out in the cold? But if he did believe that, and he was prejudiced against the Gentiles, and it's really hard to explain why Matthew, in chapter 8 of his gospel, gives us two accounts, no less than two accounts of Jesus ministering directly to Gentiles. In one instance, he exorcises a demon-possessed man. And on another occasion, he's so impressed by the faith and compassion of a Roman centurion, this Roman soldier, that he heals the guy's servant. In fact, you may remember this, after meeting that centurion, Jesus actually said in Matthew chapter 8, verse 10, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. In fact, and we already sort of mentioned this, but the whole dispute in the first place, in the early part of Matthew chapter 15, is because Jesus rebuked the elites of Israel for putting their trust in sort of man-made traditions. We talked about that a little bit last night, thinking that somehow just because they were Jewish, that God automatically kind of gave them a backstage pass. And over again, Jesus makes it clear in the Gospels that yes, the Jews are God's chosen people. In fact, he tells his disciples in Matthew chapter 10 that he was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But that doesn't mean that God has somehow forgotten the Gentiles. And it certainly doesn't mean that the Jews could just choose to forget about God. And then as if all that weren't enough, Matthew tells us back in chapter 1 of this very same gospel, there are actually 3 non-Jews, 3 Gentiles who are mentioned in Jesus' own family line. So it's pretty reasonable to conclude that when Jesus speaks these words to his disciples here in Matthew chapter 15, he's not speaking them in any kind of racist way or anything prejudiced about Gentiles. And he's certainly not saying anything cruel to this woman. In fact, if you sort of read the passage, it seems likely at this point that the woman might not even hear Jesus. She might actually be out of earshot. So you go, okay, Duffy, but what gives? Why does Jesus have this kind of odd, epic conversation? Why does he make this comment? And I think the most plausible explanation when you look at the text, and we'll soon see there's plenty of evidence to this effect, is that Jesus is actually using this incident in part as a teachable moment to help his disciples understand that he didn't come into the world so he could turn his back on human need. And the scandal of grace is that it has nothing to do with who's in the front of the line. Those who recognize their need are welcome at the table. So let's go back to verse 25 and just kind of replay. You remember here in this last-ditch effort to save her daughter, the woman comes directly to Jesus, kneels before him and begs, "Lord, help me, help me." But Jesus responds with what at first blush just sounds like a really rude comment. He basically says, well, sorry, it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. You know that. Which just sounds like a full-on insult to this Gentile woman. In fact, just using the word dogs would have been insulting in and of itself, because for Jews in the first century, a lot of you know this, dogs were the lowest of all life forms. And even as I say that, some of you are thinking, oh, well, now that really is offensive. You weren't too bothered about the Syrophoenician woman, but this is an affront that we're going to have to pray about. I mean, this just sounds wrong, because for some of us, some people, you've seen, for some people, dogs are like the highest life form on this planet, right? There's dogs, then there's elephants, then octopus, porpoise, and then way down the line, human beings, lower primates, and middle school boys. And you just go, there's just no way. When we think of dogs, we sort of think of dogs as this symbol of faithfulness and friendship. How many dog owners do we have in the rooms? Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. You don't have to bark, but I get it. You need to feed that guy a little treat. But I have to admit, I used to be a dog lover. When I was a little boy, I kind of went through a little bit of a trauma in terms of my relationship with dogs. I think it started out honestly because when I was a little kid, I'm pretty old, but I remember growing up in an era when a lot of the TV shows featured really smart dogs. First of all, there was Rin Tin Tin, and he was brilliant. And then as if that weren't enough, there was Lassie, who was this collie. He was kind of part, sheriff, part EMT, part family counselor. And it's tough. You come home from school after a hard day of trying to learn math, and you want to just turn on the TV and just chill a little bit. And there's Lassie, and Timmy comes on the screen and says, "Mommy, where's Lassie?" "Oh, don't bother her, honey. She's doing yoga." And, it was intimidating. And then this is the other thing, and this is still a little bit difficult to talk about, but we actually had 3 different dogs, and all of them were named Phoebe. Phoebe. See, you're laughing. And think about that. You're a young man, and my buddies are going to call their dog, here Duke, here Turk, here Champ, here Phoebe. It was tough. It was tough. And so I just, early on, I kind of fell out of love with dogs. But when Jews thought of dogs, there was no love whatsoever. When they thought of dogs, they thought of roving packs of scavengers that would prowl outside the city gates, eating garbage and dung and the carcasses of dead animals. Trust me, if you lived back then, you would not let your dog lick your face. For Jesus, dogs were just creatures of ultimate scorn. So this just sounds really, really rude, because Jesus is kind of implying that their Syrophoenician woman is like a dog. Come on. And some have tried to sort of soften the blow a little bit by observing that the Greek word Jesus uses here for dog is a more endearing term that means something like little puppy, little puppy, a little dog that would be allowed to in the house as a pet for the children until the dog gets bigger. So it's all good. It's all, don't worry about it. When Jesus says dog, he means it kind of his kind, sweet, cuddly little Instagram kind of way. I don't see it. I don't see it. To me, that'd be like telling your wife, you know what? With all the weight you've gained, you still have a great laugh. I just don't think it's going to work. There's still a little bit, there's still an edge there. And that's probably why this is a good place to stop and remind ourselves that whenever we are reading the Bible and we come to a hard saying like this, remember that printed words and narrated events don't always tell the full story. First of all, these quoted speeches in the Gospels, they lack often any reference to tone or inflection. And all of us understand that in daily conversation, tone and inflection is critical, right? The word no, N-O, it can have a lot of different meanings depending on how that word, those two letters are spoken. It could be no as in or it could be no as in, oh, really? I didn't know that. Or it could be no as in, I don't think so. Or it could be absolutely not, which is no wah. It's just that. It's just that two-letter word, and yet it has. In fact, how many of you here? A little quick survey. How many of you are parents of teenagers? Okay, you know how this works because let's say you're a parent of a teenager and you give some edict to your 17-year-old that they are to obey, and they look at you and they simply use the word great. G-R-E-A-T, and that can have a number of different meanings, right? It can be like, great, like, oh my gosh, that's fantastic. You are truly wise parents. But it can also be like, great, like, not that again, or great, like, that's just what I'd expect from an old person, or great, which means you've ruined my life. And it's one word, really 5 letters, and yet, depending on inflection and tone, it has all these different meanings. So we know that Jesus spoke these words in Matthew chapter 15. What we don't know is how Jesus spoke those words. We also know that Jesus lived in a world where people would often speak in parables and proverbs. And Mark, I think, did a great job of kind of reminding us and pointing to that last night. And if you didn't understand the parables or the proverbs and you weren't, familiar with them, or you took them too literally, you could really misunderstand what somebody was saying. Think about it like this. Let's suppose you don't know anything about the story of Pinocchio. You never heard that story. And so you're talking and someone says, I know somebody whose nose is growing. You're going, what? What does that mean? Or guys, you go up to your wife and say, honey, you're hot. And she goes, yeah, menopause is a bear. You have to understand the nuance. You have to understand the content. And in a passage like this, it puzzles us and it leaves us a little bit confused. We have to remember, we don't know the whole story. We don't really know if there's something that the woman heard in Jesus' tone, or maybe something she saw in his face, or even something about the way he spoke the words. But it's interesting, when Jesus said it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, this woman seemed to understand it as a parable, because she responded with an amazing combination of confidence and insight. She said, in essence, you know what? You're absolutely correct. But I'm not saying it's right to feed the dogs before you feed the children. I'm just saying even the dogs get some scraps from the master's table. And it was an amazing exchange, because it shows us that this woman understood that, Jews were God's chosen people, and that she was a Syrophoenician Canaanite woman. She wasn't there to argue about who was a dog and who should get fed first, because she wasn't coming to Jesus to demand her rights. She was coming to Jesus to plead for grace for mercy. She was basically saying, look, I don't have to be the first to the table. I'm certainly not saying I deserve that. Just please let me come to your table, because even the scraps from your table will be more than enough to meet my needs. And when Jesus saw that, he said, you know what, woman? Great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire. And Matthew tells us her daughter was healed instantly. Instantly. And you know what's interesting? It's the only time in Matthew's gospel where Jesus describes someone's faith as great. And in this case, it really means like great. So this wasn't Jesus misspeaking, okay? Or Jesus being rude, or Jesus being racist. This was just Jesus being Jesus. You know, surprising, yes. Scandalous, maybe, but totally in control and always animated by grace, mercy, and compassion. And what we need to see this morning, men and women, in this epic conversation that took place on the pages of Matthew chapter 15, is that Jesus fleshed out for us two big truths I want us to know. And the first is this. Truth number one, all are welcome at the table of grace. All are welcome at the table of grace. No one should be turned away empty-handed. Because you see, here's the problem with a lot of us who call ourselves disciples of Jesus. We love him, we believe in him, and we want to serve him. But sometimes, like Jesus' disciples in Matthew 15, we kind of think we're the ones to decide who ought to be welcomed into the presence of Jesus. Like those folks, you know, they're too this, they're too that. They come with a sketchy background. They're too much of a low life. They're too much of a high flyer. They're too liberal. They're too Republican. They're too different from us. They aren't the kind of people, frankly, that get chosen by God. Because see, just like us, the disciples were too willing to give up on and turn away those who they thought were too lost, too far gone. And you see this over and over again. You see examples of this, all too eager to turn people away from Jesus. In Matthew chapter 19, the disciples tried to send away the children. You know, they're too noisy, they're rambunctious, they won't understand. Jesus said, you know what, let them come. Let them come. Matthew chapter 14, the disciples said, Lord, there are 5,000 hungry people on this hillside. We need to send them away so they can get something to eat, so they can get bread. Jesus said, you know what? You feed them. You feed them. They're going to stay right here. You feed them. And here in Matthew chapter 15, the disciples said, Lord, send away this Canaanite woman. She's different. She's annoying. She's all icky. And she's making us uncomfortable. Jesus engaged with her, listened to her, and said, this is what great faith looks like. This is what great faith looks like. We disciples, brothers and sisters, need to be reminded again and again that there is always room at the table of grace. And by the way, let's be sure to recognize that sometimes we turn people away from the table not by who we exclude, but by who we fail to invite. Maybe you've wondered about maybe sharing your faith with a colleague at work, or a friend at the gym, or a buddy on the team, or another mom from school, and thought, no way. You know, they're never going to respond. They're too far gone. They're too proud. They don't even believe in God. Listen. Not every desperate person is bold enough and honest enough to come to Jesus like this Gentile woman did. Sometimes it takes the sensitive, caring invitation of a friend. If we learn anything from this passage about what it means to approach God, it is that all are welcome. Now, please understand, none of this means that sin isn't sin. None of this means that sin is not a grave offense against God. In fact, it is our sin that leaves us hungry, that leaves us desperate and possessed by dark power. It's our sin that leaves us with appetites that only lead to emptiness. No great physician is going to ignore our sin if he really, truly wants to heal us. Jesus didn't say the one, demon was, listen, ma'am, you're being a little bit judgmental. You're kind of a hater. That's just who she is. Let her be demon possessed. Jesus didn't say that. He didn't say that. As a great physician, he took the disease seriously. But as the great physician, he was never going to turn away someone diseased, someone needy, someone in peril. No one who comes to the table hungry and humble will be sent away empty-handed. All are welcome. But there's a second big truth we need to see this morning, and we see it vividly in the life of this Syrophoenician woman. It's true that nobody who comes by faith to the Father's table is ever sent away empty-handed. But the one requirement that he makes of us in coming to the table is we have to realize our hands are truly empty. You know, it's interesting to sort of stop and ask yourself, well, what was it that Jesus found so remarkable about this woman? And as you look at the text, there are a few hints. I mean, first of all, if you look in verse 22, we see she was persistent. She was persistent. Even when Jesus didn't answer her, she continued to call out to him. She somehow understood probably one of the most basic principles of faithful prayer, that silence is not the same as indifference. Take note of that. In your prayers, silence is not the same as indifference. Just because Jesus doesn't answer your prayer, that doesn't mean he doesn't hear your prayer or care about your prayer. She was persistent. Even when the disciples tried to shoo her away and shut her up. In fact, the verb that's actually used in verse 22 for crying means literally to beg. In fact, in the Greek, it's what's called the present progressive tense, which literally means she was begging and she kept on begging and she kept on begging. She was persistent. But what's also noteworthy is that verse 27, she had ears to hear. She had ears to hear. Do you know that this woman, this Gentile woman, is the first person described in Mark's gospel as hearing and understanding a parable of Jesus? This woman. Which is interesting in light of our studies in the evening with Mark. She understands that when Jesus uses the dog language, he's not insulting her, he's giving her a parable. And in fact, she not only embraces the parable, she even answers Jesus in terms of his own parable. Jesus said, it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And the woman said, yeah, but even the dogs get some scraps from the master's table. One of the Lord's ongoing complaints about Israel in the Bible is they do not have ears to hear. They do not have eyes to see. This Canaanite woman, maybe she doesn't understand everything about Jesus and the Messiah, but what she does know, she's taking it to heart. She had ears to hear and the heart to obey. But probably, from what we see in the text, what most moved Jesus about this woman was her humble faith. Her humble faith. She understood she had zero leverage in this equation. It was she who had the need and Jesus who had the supply. She wasn't thinking, as we often do, of sort of striking a bargain with the big man upstairs, or sort of imagining this fairy godmother God, who just wants us to be happy. Oh my gosh. Or that we're alive and therefore we are entitled to a good life. It often reminds me of the woman, who had her portrait done. Maybe you heard about this. And after the portrait was done, she looked at the artist and said, I do not like this picture of me, this painting. It does not do me justice. And he looked at her and said, ma'am, with a face like yours, you don't want justice. You want mercy. Well, you know what? This woman wasn't pleading for justice. She was pleading for mercy. That's what faith is about. If you look at this Syrophoenician woman in verse 22, she was not pleading for what she deserved. She was asking for something she knew she probably didn't deserve. She understood that in terms of her own righteousness and her own story. She was as desperate as a hungry dog and grateful for even the slightest morsel from the master's table. And in terms of our approach to God this morning, nothing could be more important. Because the scripture tells us that one of the biggest symptoms of sin in our lives is that we don't want to fully come to terms with our desperation and need. We still kind of cling to the idea, most of us deep down, that we can earn our way into the healing presence of God. Somehow, we're going to show God our religious resume. We're going to show him our portfolio of good deeds or amazing accomplishments, and we're going to be ushered to the front of the line and to the table of the Lord. The Bible makes it clear that the only grounds for our approach to God is mercy and grace. A grace that gets paid out by Jesus' death on the cross for us. Jesus didn't say, you know what, woman, how great is your righteousness? He said, how great is your faith? How great is your faith? She was saved by grace through faith, not by her works. As the hymn writer put it, nothing in my hands I bring, simply to the cross I cling. I wonder, in the beauty of this gorgeous morning in this beautiful place, if there are some desperate people here. From where I stand, it doesn't look like it. You look pretty calm, pretty much okay, sort of put together. But I also know there's a lot of desperation. Not just here, but all around us in our world today. And I hope this morning that we have ears to hear this truth. As Tim Keller put it, the good news of Jesus Christ is that we are far more wicked than we ever dared to believe, but we are far more loved and accepted than we ever dared to hope. You know, maybe what brought you here this morning to Mount Hermon this weekend, just like the woman in Matthew chapter 15 is concerned for your children, you know, a daughter or a son or marriage, or maybe for your own emotional and spiritual health. The lesson of this passage is that healing begins when you approach God with an honest confession of need and a bold, persistent belief that he and he alone can meet our need. If we ever forget how scandalous is this grace, imagine it like this. Imagine this mangy, ugly, dirty junkyard dog, a dog that's been lapping up garbage, biting the hand of its master, all of a sudden being invited to come eat at the king's table without any regard for where he's been or what he's been into. That's grace. What happened that day in Matthew chapter 15? That wasn't Jesus misspeaking. Matthew chapter 15 is not about an amazing gaffe. Matthew chapter 15 is about amazing grace. Let's pray. Lord, we sit here today, and again, we all look good on the outside, probably like the Pharisees, and yet Jesus used the term whitewashed tombs. What was refreshing, what was absolutely life-changing, what was epic about this conversation was the woman was willing to admit her desperate need. I pray, Lord, for me, for my brothers and sisters, for my friends, for people who are here this weekend because my wife wanted me, or my husband asked me, or my parents said they'd like us to be here. But all of us are Syrophoenicians. All of us, Lord, are on the outside looking in, except but by your grace and the blood you shed on the cross. Help us this weekend to come to you with persistence and hope and confidence that you will not turn us away. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.